Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moir, and with me I have my colleague Mark Daughter. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Jo.
And in Auckland we have Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Jo. Hi, Mark.
Now, before we get started, I've got a bit of an issue this week. I just felt like I need to air it. I've been really upset by the fact that a lot of people don't seem to know the difference between Palmerston North and New Plymouth. This has come about as a result of the football women's team who apparently left Palmerston North because it was so boring. Now, for the rest of however long Raw Politics lasts, I'm going to bring my Taranaki mug with me to every single episode and drink out of it so that everyone realises that New Plymouth is in Taranaki and we have a beautiful mountain and we are not anything like Palmerston North, which is a very, very rubbish city.
Yeah, I mean, I love New Plymouth and I could do without Palmerston North.
Is there anything to do at night, though, in New Plymouth?
Plenty. Tim, I can't believe you were even raising this.
There's the beautiful gardens over summer with the lights. That's very cool.
Festival of Lights, free, magnificent. Great bars, we've got a foreshore walkway, there's museums. Who doesn't like Len Lai? I mean, there is a lot, Tim. There's a lot.
Great bird watching.
Yeah, Barcelona of the South.
Exactly. I mean, that's what we all say. Anyway, moving on. Today, we're chatting about the politics, policies and potholes of transport, and then we'll do our best to explain what the political polls are saying and what it might or might not mean come election day. First up, transport is the topic of the week, from National's $24 billion announcement on Monday to the possible death of Auckland Light Rail and Wellington getting anything but moving. Tim, let's come and have a chat to you about this first 4 lanes from Tauranga to Whangarei, which wasn't actually quite that. We saw the National Party walk that back a little bit because it's actually going to be quite a long time before you'd get 4 lanes right through there. What they've announced with this initial bit is obviously just a few snippets of that. What have you made of this? I mean, roads seem to get announced every now and again in election cycles. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Is that fair?
Yeah, National has obviously done some polling ongoing that tells them that people really do like these roads of national significance. They keep running it up. Win or lose in elections, it's still there as a sort of a centrepiece, a kind of a cornerstone. So you've got to say that while the urban metro commentariat might say this is kind of old-fashioned and obviously anti-climate in terms of the emissions and so on, they must be sensing that there is support out there for putting right, particularly between provincial towns and cities, problems that are there. And I think, you know, the idea of linking Whangarei to Tauranga is not new. The idea of making it 4 lanes the whole way in 10 years is absurd. The 4 lanes that have gone, I think, from the Bombay Hills to just past Cambridge, which is a small portion of that vast distance they're talking about, took about 30 years in stages. So it's a fine goal that, yes, you might have safe double-laned highways from Whangarei to Auckland and then down to Tauranga. So it just is a thing that National believes is a vote gainer for them in provincial and smaller urban New Zealand. And I think it can't be dismissed as in terms of the politics of it. I'm not talking about the costs necessarily yet, nor about obviously what you wrote about, Mark, and so well about the sort of the turning the back on the emissions reduction aspects of transport. But in terms of votes, it's got to be that. It's got to be there for them, and they're believing hard in it and going again.
Yeah, well, and it also, I mean, it does completely overestimate how quickly we can build anything in this country ever. I mean, it's just absolutely farcical to suggest that you could have all of that happen in 10 years. But it almost feels like when you get into this point of the election cycle that nobody seems to care about that, and you just kind of say whatever, and you hope that, you know, most voters don't actually think through how long these things take. And the fact that when they do get a nice bit of road or even a pothole fixed outside, it's actually usually taken a couple of years for that to have happened. So, yeah, pretty crazy stuff, but, you know, it's an election year, so be it. Let's come back to the point that you raised, though, Tim, about the climate stuff. Mark, you wrote about that a lot this week. Have National taken into consideration carbon emissions in terms of transportation, etc., at all? And also, is Labor taking that into consideration as well?
Yeah, in terms of the policy workings, there's nothing in there about the emissions that'll be associated with the roads. Emissions come from a couple of different things. One of them is building the roads. Your concrete, your asphalt, those all involve, industrial processes, burning of fossil fuels, that sort of thing. And also, we know building a new road induces more traffic. It incentivizes people to drive. If it's easier to get somewhere by car than by public transport or walking or cycling, then you're more likely to drive your car. And so, the whole climate change program is designed not necessarily to make it harder to get around by car, but to make it easier to get around by public transport or walking and cycling. But by building these big roads, we're probably locking in some car dependency for quite a while to come, which is, from a climate perspective, not wonderful. National's rebuttal to that is we're going to be using EVs soon anyways, but it's actually a while away. Even if we reached 100% of all the vehicles coming into New Zealand being EVs, which is nowhere near that at the moment, it would still take more than a decade to get the entire vehicle fleet to be electric. So we're talking many, many years away by the point where EVs are most of the cars on the road. And in the meantime, getting more people into their cars means more carbon emissions. You asked about Labour as well. I asked David Parker, the Transport Minister, and the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, about the climate impacts, and neither of them were too keen to go after National on this. David Parker's response was actually, we really like some of the projects that they've proposed and some of the roads that they've proposed. We just don't think they've done the costings right. And Chris Hipkins kind of gave some, milquetoast sort of words around climate and having a balanced transport program, but clearly he's not out there wanting to attack roads or being seen as anti-road either. And like you say, Tim, it's the politics of it. It's the fact that, Kiwis love their cars, love their utes in particular, but love their cars, love going on a road trip, take the boat with you up from Auckland to Northland. And roads are fundamental to doing that. So there's sort of a cultural thing here. It's got a lot of powerful value, and Labor does not want to be seen to be attacking roads.
Yeah, you're totally right with David Parker and Chris Hipkins did a terrible job of really actually opposing any of this. All they seem to want to talk about was the gigantic fiscal hole. I feel like fiscal hole is going to be a rather large talking point, which kills me a little bit inside, although I did enjoy Nicola Willis asking Grant Robertson in the House on Thursday how big his hole was, which is, as Grant Robertson pointed out, quite inappropriate and not in the public interest. Big lols all around in the House.
Jo, in terms of Nationals roading, they must, again, be thinking of these roads in safety terms as well, Mark, in fairness to them. Because these are the provincial highways I'm talking about, not sort of the road through Wellington or the kinds of other sort of mass transit projects for buses they're talking about in Auckland and so on. But the provincial roads, New Zealand's roads are very poor, actually, and in very bad repair in terms of their safety. And I know that when the Greens were part of the government and had an associate transport minister, they were talking too then about safety aspects that were necessary as well. So National should be able to parlay some of this into making very poor roads, like the one north of Tauranga going up towards Waihi and Omokoroa is terrible, and it's had a bad record, with tragedy as well. So that there's arguments to be made for some of these, and that's probably partly what David Parker means as well. As it turns out, Labor had some transport they brought to the table too, but their roading and transport policy was putting right things that are broken most recently, things that have gone wrong and been, spoiled and ruined by the weather and the cyclones, which is a little bit like kind of Labor offering voters sort of, we'll panel beat your car and put it back as it was, no benefit, no worse, but no better. And National saying, well, here, look, we'll buy you a new Mustang, SUV. That's the comparison in terms of appeal. So Labor's doing what any government needed to do and National would have done, but it just in the same week as National's talking about these sort of big, glossy, big billion-dollar kind of changes, Labor is talking about just putting things right.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning too the fact that you have got National increasingly putting more policy out. I think we're almost at the 30 mark now in terms of policy. Some of them are small fry, but this was a big, meaty announcement. And what I wrote about this week was the fact that you've got this situation where the Prime Minister and the government is still trying to be the government and do the governing thing. But actually, because National's putting all of this policy out, they're getting asked all these questions about, well, what will Labor do? And Chris Hipkins very, very reluctant this week to switch into his Labor leader hat. And so sort of obfuscating all over the place, not wanting to say what their own policy is because they don't actually want to get into the meaty policies until we're into the official campaign period in September, start of September. And they want to have this period to continue to govern. And it's just it's a difficult space. It's not new. I would definitely make that point. I think every government in just about every election has had this issue of the opposition throwing policy out there and the Prime Minister being forced to try sort of switch into their party hat and not wanting to. So, Key endured that, Helen Clark, Jacinda Ardern, Bill English, they all did. But yeah, it's getting difficult for Labor because they're not saying what they're doing, and so they're almost becoming the opposition when it comes to the rollout of these policies. And National's going, here's this big glitzy thing, and Labor's kind of the one scrambling and opposing, but not offering anything themselves. So that's a really hard space for them, I think, for the next few weeks. And I do wonder whether it might push Labor to actually start to announce some bigger stuff maybe in the next week or two, just to sort of try and get back on the front foot again.
And the other aspect of this is that what I've come across is that Labor is not planning and holding sort of public gatherings and meetings around the country for people to come along and hear about what they are doing, what they've done, perhaps what they plan, and maybe that'll be time with some announcements of policy. The other thing is they're not putting people up even yet, or ministers at least, until Parliament rises as panels in public debates. So you've got these things where some more junior Labor MPs are being deputed to go out and hold up the side for Labor because I think Hipkins doesn't want to see his ministry being regarded as politicised, as cabinet ministers going out there and battling and politicking. But that leaves them again with fewer weeks to try and even that fight up. So from September on, when Parliament rises, must be a very intense period Labor's planning for us.
Let's look at what the latest polls are saying 4 weeks out from the campaign officially starting. Now, because I hate explaining things, Mark, I'm going to throw you under the bus here. Can you just give us a bit of an idea of where sort of polls in recent months are in terms of party vote and preferred Prime Minister and what sort of trends we're seeing?
Yeah, it's been a little while since we've had a poll that didn't show National and ACT able to govern on their own, but the margin's always been quite small. I think 2, maybe 3 seats is the largest that we've seen. So it's a very close election, but it's an election for National and ACT to lose. It's one where actually Labour, the Greens, the Māori Party need to regain some ground if they want to be in a position to govern after the election. New Zealand First is floating around in there, edging up towards 5%, but there's a question as to how permanent that is and with all the minor party polling, how reliable that number is. Greens seem to be moving up a little bit as well. Labour definitely clearly down, particularly in the wake of these sort of ministerial scandals that we've covered over the past few weeks. And National, often rising, but not as much. Not by as much as Labour is falling, because some of that vote is going to the Greens, some of it also to ACT, which is doing quite well, almost always in the double digits now, sort of 11, 12%, quite a significant part of whatever might be a centre-right government.
Just thinking about the News Hub Read Research poll, which came out on Wednesday night, so that's the most recent one that we've got this week. Tim, what struck me about that particular poll is that it basically said that Christopher Luxon can be 8 points behind Chris Hipkins on preferred Prime Minister. His trust can be down at 30-odd% below Chris Hipkins as well. But actually, he can still be Prime Minister, and that you don't actually need to be trusted and you don't need to be liked in order to end up governing. What does that say, I guess, about the sort of, the narrative that often runs around polls that, you've got to be likeable, you've got to have trust? I mean, is this just all flipped upside down because we've got 2 people who nobody is particularly inspired by at the moment, or what's your read on it?
I think you're right on that bit, that neither are very inspiring. I've never really been that enthused by either preferred Prime Minister polling figures or the trust, those kind of ones that look at people's characteristics. Yes, if it's overwhelmingly bad and stubborn and you never move, I think that's going to harm you. He's not great, but as you say, the party's in an okay place. 36.6 isn't great. You know, Bill English got 45 point something when he fell, but in that election, Jacinda Ardern got 36.9 or something like that. So they're right there in a sort of you're in the place where you can start looking at being a meaningful, negotiator with the other parties. And with ACT being so strong, as we know, New Zealand First creeping up, it's looking pretty good. So it's a bit like what you wrote. He can be someone who people don't particularly trust or like, but he can still govern if he gets this together. And there have been lots of people who haven't been particularly likeable who have ended up in that chair.
And the New Zealand First factor is an interesting one because, of course, we had Roy Morgan come out in the last week, which had New Zealand First at 5%. Now, I'm interested in your guys' view on Roy Morgan. Do you take it with a massive grain of salt? Is it bonkers? Because actually you've now had the News Hub Read Research poll have New Zealand First at 4.1. So maybe Roy Morgan isn't as out as some people like to often suggest it is. Is that fair, Mark?
Yeah, I think there are every pollster has a few kind of well-known biases when you compare them to other polls, to the sort of polling average. I think you always have to take those into account. And I think the rule that you apply to Roy Morgan, as for anyone, is if it looks a lot different from the other polls, it's probably not right. I think the fact that the News Hub Read Research poll kind of backs it up, at least in trend, if not an exact number, is a sign that, they're probably ballpark. New Zealand First is clearly growing, whether it's exactly at 5% or a little bit below or a little bit above. You can never really expect to get that answer from a poll anyways.
Mm. And so that begs the question, though, Tim, what does National, and it's National that needs to be talking about what they're going to do about New Zealand First, because obviously Winston Peters has ruled out Labour, so Chris Hipkins can go away and not even care about it. What is National going to have to do? Do they go down the track of ruling them out? Of course, we've had ACT this week, David Seymour sort of almost saying that they wouldn't work with New Zealand First. Brooke Van Velden has then kind of walked that back a little bit. It's a little bit all over the place. What do they do about it?
Well, first thing is Winston's numbers came in these two polls came after his annual meeting. And so he got a fair bit of TV and a fair bit of coverage straight out of that. So you'd expect to have some profile. I think they'll get back in. I think they are now looking like a repository for 0.5% here, 0.5% there, 0.7% here of the some of the cookers, some of the antis, some of the factions that are out there are sort of opposed to everything. And so that's added to a normal core of the kind of provincial hardcore New Zealand First people. So my thought is that New Zealand First will re-emerge and that 4 is maybe a little bit high at this point, but when they usually get in the 3s and they're coming up at this point in the cycle, and it'd be interesting to go back and look at all those figures, and we will, to see that they usually get over the top. So yes, National has to consider what it does. It'll keep hoping that ACT and National together can get that 63 seats they're at the moment, or even 61, and not have to go there as well. But it's an insurance policy, isn't it? What I don't understand, and I'd love you, Jo, to explain this to me, is how Winston has been able to rule out Labour, given that for 30 years we can't rule in or out because it's the electorate's decision. We can't second guess. We will never go against and go ahead of the electorate. How is it possible in any rational way for him to invert that now and rule out one side?
I'm just taking a stab here because I certainly am not deep in the inner thoughts of Winston Peters' head, but presumably Winston Peters in 2023 and his party is, and I think this shows anyway, is actually quite a different party. I think who they're going for and who they're targeting, the electorate they're after, is really different to what it has been at previous times in the election. And he is worried that everyone still says that New Zealand First is to blame for Labour being in government in 2017. And everything that's happened and everything that he rails against, which at times is laughable because he goes on about all of these terrible decisions during COVID, sort of almost like compartmentalising himself, who just happened to be the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, and puts himself over in this little corner, and apparently he had nothing to do with it. But yeah, that's a difficult spot for them, that there are people who will never vote New Zealand First again because of that 2017 decision. And so they've completely changed tack. I think they've pivoted massively in terms of who they are seeking their vote from. And that means that he thinks that he can get away with changing up the way that he's always looked at election days previously, and can rule people out and say, oh, well, this is where we're at in 2023.
I do think, the rule in, rule out thing on coalitions, as media, we ask a lot of questions of politicians, and Jo and I did that on Thursday of Brooke Van Velden, trying to figure out exactly where ACT sits in relation to New Zealand First. But the reality is, you can make whatever promises you want, but if there's a path to power after the election, chances are you're going to take it. I think it's unlikely that a party would turn down that opportunity and go to another election or resign themselves to opposition just because of a promise they'd made beforehand. And, maybe that's not the case with Winston, given how badly going with Labour has backfired for him. But, there's also a question of how much longer he plans to be in the game and how much more the sort of reputation protection is important, or is it, you get over the hurdle here and that's the main focus, and after you've done that, you worry about the next election in 3 years' time.
One other thing that I just want to mention too is sort of what wins and loses elections and policy stuff. Now, the reason I'm shoehorning this in is because I want to make a prediction myself, which I've just had a massive debate with Mark about earlier. This paid parental leave stuff that's happened this week, where Nicola Willis has had a members' bill saying that, we've got 26 weeks paid parental leave, but you want to give parents the flexibility so that if both parents want to be home for 13 weeks each, because actually times are quite tough after the baby's been born, then you can do that, because at the moment it doesn't allow for that. Now, this was a members' bill. It got supported by everyone except for Labour. Now, Labour has completely not explained why it is unable to support that bill, which actually seems to make sense, because who wants the government in your house kind of telling you how you should or shouldn't use your paid parental leave? And the only thing that I can actually kind of work out that might be why they're doing this, because these headlines are terrible for them, is that their big thing during the campaign is going to be a big paid parental leave announcement. And the last thing they want to do is go support some Nicola Willis National Party idea, when actually they've got their whole own big massive thing that they're going to do, whether it will probably incorporate that it can be more flexible, probably add some more weeks to it. Who knows? I think it will be really big. You've heard it here first on Raw Politics. There you go.
I'll step in real quick to defend Labour, which is giving you an insight into the debate we had, which is I don't think that their reasons for voting against the bill make sense, but their reasons for concerns about the bill, they did elaborate those, which is basically that they don't want to see people splitting it 50-50, taking 13 weeks, and then no one home with the baby after that, because it's not good for, it's important for the newborns and babies to be with their parents for a much longer time than that. But those are changes you can make in the select committee process and the committee of the whole House process. So it doesn't justify voting against the bill per se. You kind of wish that Labour would stick to that messaging, though. In the House on Thursday, Carmel Sepuloni was going quite hard on basically the reason we didn't vote for the bill is because National didn't support parental leave in 2002, which makes it feel really partisan, really nasty, and
well, it's also a stupid reason, which is why I just think that they're doing something themselves, because there's no way that you can just be that bad at politics. I mean, that it is terribly bad politics.
I guess what I'm trying to say is I think they could, despite that, sell it a bit better than they have been.
Yeah, I can agree with you on that. Our audience question this week is, why are so many MPs getting called before the Privileges Committee? Mark, Tim van der Molen, Simon Court, Jan Tinetti, Michael Wood, what are they all up to?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been a long time since the Privileges Committee was used at all, and now we've had 4 MPs sent there in such a short span of time. It started with Jan Tinetti and her sort of mixed answers around the truancy figures and their sort of release process. But since then, we've had 3 more MPs go. It almost feels a little bit like, MPs saw Giantonetti chucked to the committee and remembered that it was there and they could use it to enforce the standing orders. And maybe it feels a little bit partisan as well with this latest one of Tim van der Molen, the complaint coming in many weeks after the event in question is sort of alleged to have happened. Maybe it's a chance to get back and it's going to be sort of a back and forth thing. Hopefully it's not a tool that gets too politicized because it sort of plays an important checks and balances role. But I guess we'll find out.
I'm just going to add, Mark, that we can't ascribe motive to the MPs or the complainants because that might get us before the Privileges Committee as well. But in some other jurisdiction, you might have seen MPs of one party deciding to play back, a bullying or a misbehaviour allegation because they've been subject to such allegations themselves from another party. I'm not saying that's what's happened here, but that could have happened in another jurisdiction. And so we could well find that, there'll be allegations or at least some talk of tit for tat and maybe a slight misuse of process here.
Great walking of the legal tightrope there, Tim.
I'm pretty sure I fell off the legal tightrope then.
Any issues and complaints, please send them to tim.murphy@newsroom.co.nz.
We'll just hope no MPs listen to this podcast. No Labour MPs.
Okay, well, let's wrap things up with some recommendations. Something that you guys have watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. Tim?
Mine's a watch and it's on radio on RNZ. From Farrar Hancock, who has compiled a brilliant graphic treatment and package on the polls, recent and long-term, as well as donations and also advertising spends on social media by the parties. Well worth a look, really good, really easy.
My recommendation this week is Joel Maxwell, who is a writer for Stuff's Potiaki. He's done a comic piece this week. It's called As Election Looms, Can We Have a Safe Campaign Season for Māori? And it's just a really good look at the way that Māori issues and sort of using Māori as a political football often happens around this time of an election cycle. And he's just laid it all out really nicely. So recommend that one. Mark?
Yeah, I'm recommending the New York Times Magazine piece on the origins of COVID-19 that came out last week, actually. It's long, which I appreciate, but nuanced. It's in-depth. It's a big debate that's been happening for 3 years about where this came from. Was there a laboratory involved? Could it have been entirely natural? What's going on? And I think it's a really fair evaluation of the different competing claims, looking into sort of the reasons why people are arguing things and maybe trying to take a little bit of the heat out of what's an important question because, understanding how this came about is important to understanding how we stop it from happening again.
If I started sending you sort of mandatory reading that was really short, do you think it would have any influence on your own word count?
I read a lot on Twitter, so I'm very familiar with reading short things. It doesn't seem to have solved my word count.
It definitely isn't.
Mark, did the origin of COVID include identifying whether the bat was real or whether it was a human dressed as a bat?
I stand with the Chinese zoo. I've seen these bears. You can see them at the Wellington Zoo. I recommend going there, not sponsored. And they just are weird-looking bears. And so, I think it was a real bear.
And a real bat.
And a real bat. Or maybe not. That's the question in the story.
Okay, that's it from Raw Politics this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, for tolerating all of that, our readers, listeners, and viewers. Please send any questions you have to me, jo.moir@newsroom.co.nz. Thank you, Tim and Mark, very much.
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.
You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.